Patras is a gentle place, a coastal city that moves slower than the rest of Greece, where neighbors share coffee and families stay close. It was here that Marina Giorgio lived with her 3 daughters in a modest apartment with pale pink walls and a balcony full of potted plants. People who passed her in the supermarket saw a tired but attentive mother, always with one child in her arms and the others within reach. She smiled easily, if a little sadly, and she was the type to ask after your health even if you barely knew her. From the outside, Marina's life looked ordinary, even admirable. But what no one saw, what even those closest to her couldn't begin to suspect, was that she had begun to believe a terrifying lie. Not just believe it, but build her world around it. Marina needed people to love her, to pity her, to see her as someone enduring unthinkable pain. She wasn't trying to hurt anyone, not at first. She just didn't know how to be invisible. That's how it starts, sometimes. With someone who's been overlooked for too long. Someone who decides they'd rather be tragic than ignored. Someone who learns how easily a tear can protect a secret. And so when her first daughter fell ill, no one questioned it. Not the doctors. Not the nurses. Not her own family. Because who would ever suspect the grieving mother? It was the kind of morning that begins in silence, a gray April dawn, the streets of Patras still hushed, the kind of air where grief can quietly slip in before anyone knows it's arrived. Melina, just 3.5 years old, woke up gasping for breath. Her cough, which had been light the day before, had deepened overnight into something sharp, almost mechanical. She was pale, sweaty, confused. Her small fingers gripped the edge of her mother's nightgown, seeking comfort. Marina didn't wait. She called the ambulance herself. Her voice, recorded on the dispatch line, was frantic. She said her daughter was choking. She wasn't sure on what, and that she needed help now. When paramedics arrived, Marina was already out front with Melina in her arms, wrapped in a soft yellow blanket. Her panic looked real. Her hands trembled. Her eyes were wide. Doctors in the emergency unit suspected a respiratory illness, possibly asthma, possibly something viral. Melina was admitted. Nurses described Marina as cooperative, attentive, but tightly wound. She didn't leave her daughter's side, they said. She asked for updates every 15 minutes. She cried when blood was drawn, flinched when machines beeped. And then, that evening, without warning, Melina's heart stopped. It was a death that made no sense. She had stabilized. Her vitals had improved. And then, without any sign, her breath halted. Her body went still. Doctors rushed in. The code was called. For 22 minutes, they tried to resuscitate her, but it was as if something unseen had pulled the life out of her. Marina collapsed in the hallway. She screamed her daughter's name until her throat gave out. She pounded the floor. Nurses wrapped her in blankets. Her sobs were raw, her pain seemingly uncontrollable. It was the kind of performance grief demands, and no one questioned it. The death certificate cited pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs, possibly a complication, possibly a genetic defect. The autopsy noted no clear trauma, no marks, no external evidence of wrongdoing. Melina was buried beneath a cherry tree at the local cemetery. Her casket was white, her photo framed with lilies. At the funeral, Marina stood with her arms folded across her chest, her eyes red but dry. People hugged her. They brought casseroles. They whispered about fate and unfairness. She was such a good mother, one woman said. You could see it in how she held her daughters. Others nodded. No one doubted her. Marina made sure of that. But there was something quietly off about how the grief unfolded. Marina's sadness came in waves, but always on cue. She never stumbled over details. She never forgot times, dates, instructions. Her story was perfectly rehearsed. Her pain, though loud, never spilled over into confusion. She was tidy, measured, careful. The doctors who had tried to save Melina were disturbed, not just by the sudden death, but by how swiftly Marina moved forward. Within weeks, she was posting online, tributes to Melina, poetic captions, angel emojis. But nothing raw, nothing unscripted. And when she returned to the hospital for a follow-up meeting with the pediatrician, She smiled. Calm. Controlled. She asked the right questions, expressed gratitude, even apologized for how emotional she'd been. I just want to make sure this never happens again, she said softly. It was then, in retrospect, that one doctor felt a chill. Because Marina wasn't broken. She was watchful. Not mourning, but managing. Processing reactions. Calculating outcomes. Seeing how people responded to a young mother struck by inexplicable loss. Melina's death was labeled a tragedy. Nothing more. The file was closed. And Marina walked away with the one thing she needed most, a precedent. Proof that when her children died, the world looked away, too polite or too afraid to ask why. That first goodbye passed without resistance. It was grieved in public, prayed over in private, and folded into the long, painful history of unexplained childhood loss. But what no one saw, what no one even imagined, was that Marina wasn't just a mother living through tragedy. She was testing the waters, measuring how far she could go. And with every sympathetic glance, every well-meaning condolence, she learned something chilling. The more she cried, the less people saw. And the silence around Melina's death gave Marina her first true taste of control. The kind of control she would soon hunger for again. After Melina's death, something in Marina seemed to harden, though to the outside world, she softened. Her social media became a shrine, not of pain, but of curated sadness. Candles. Filtered photos. Scripture verses about angels. She walked through grief the way someone might walk through a museum, careful not to touch anything too real. But behind closed doors, her focus had shifted. Melina was gone, and now there were 2 children left. Georgina, then age 6, and baby Iris, born just 6 months after her sister's passing. To neighbors, Marina was the picture of perseverance. She took Georgina to school each morning. She pushed Iris's stroller on long walks by the harbor. She smiled. She laughed when appropriate. But those who knew her best said she was vigilant, watching every interaction, monitoring every word. Her husband, Christos, tried to move on. He busied himself with work, convinced himself that fate had played a cruel hand. But as time passed, Georgina began to change. She grew anxious, flinched at loud noises, cried when left alone. When asked if something was wrong, she would shake her head, mute, almost robotic. Marina dismissed it as trauma. She insisted Georgina was grieving in her own way. Teachers believed her. Doctors believed her. Everyone did. After all, who would doubt the woman who had already buried a child? Then, in March 2021, tragedy struck again. Baby Iris was found unresponsive in her crib. Marina called emergency services with the same tearful panic she'd shown for Melina. But this time, paramedics were uneasy. Iris's body showed no signs of illness. Her vitals had been normal at her last pediatric checkup. There was no fever, no infection, no explanation. Marina's explanation was simple. She had put Iris down for a nap and returned to find her not breathing. It sounded plausible. Horrible, but plausible. And once again, her grief played well in public. The news was sympathetic. The doctors puzzled. The community mourned. But behind the scenes, suspicions began to stir. 2 infant deaths in one family within 2 years? Statistically rare. Still, without physical evidence, there was no case. No crime. Just heartbreak. Marina, meanwhile, used the moment. She organized a fundraiser in Iris's memory. She spoke at a local event about childhood loss. She leaned into the role of the strong, broken mother, admired, pitted, untouchable. And Georgina? She grew quieter. Her drawings turned darker. Her sleep became fitful. At school, she often stared out the window, lost in thought. No one pressed her. No one asked. But silently, Marina was spiraling. The lies were stacking. The attention was addictive. And the need for control, over perception, over emotion, over outcome, was growing stronger. Because Marina didn't just want sympathy. She wanted something deeper. Reverence. The kind given to those who survive the unimaginable. The kind that no one questions. And when that attention began to fade, when people moved on from Iris, just as they had from Melina, Marina faced a terrifying realization. Grief had an expiration date. But performance? That could be renewed. Georgina, now 9, was her last thread to the identity she'd built. The grieving mother, the tragic figure. And in January 2022, Marina made a decision that would finally unravel everything. It would begin again with a hospital visit and end with a vial of ketamine. By March 2024, Marina Giorgio was formally charged with the murders of her 3 daughters. The shockwave that followed cracked through the heart of Patras like a seismic aftershock. Reporters flooded the courthouse steps. Angry crowds, many of them parents themselves, gathered with placards and demands for justice. And inside a heavily guarded courtroom, Marina sat pale, her expression unreadable, as the full weight of her secrets began to bear down. The prosecution didn't waste time. They painted Marina not as a grieving mother, but as a calculated manipulator. Their timeline was chilling. Each child, they said, had died under Marina's exclusive care. Each death had happened in moments when no one else was present. And each time, she had played the same role, the helpless, heartbroken mother, rushing her daughters to the hospital too late, but always with an explanation. An infection, a seizure, a tragic coincidence. But the evidence said otherwise. The medical examiner presented toxicology results that confirmed Georgina, the oldest, had ketamine in her system, a substance used in hospitals, but never administered to the child during her stay. The amount was lethal. There was no medical justification for ketamine in Georgina's case, the expert stated flatly, glancing toward Marina, who looked down, avoiding eye contact. Then came the most haunting discovery. The exhumations of Melina and Iris had shown signs of suffocation, petechial hemorrhaging around the eyes, blocked airways, subtle signs that had originally gone unnoticed, but which screamed foul play upon reevaluation. The prosecution alleged that Marina had staged each emergency, calculated each moment alone with her daughters, and performed the role of devastated mother with chilling precision. She called doctors in panic, demanded attention, sometimes even yelled in the emergency room, only to switch to a calm, polite demeanor once others arrived. The courtroom heard audio recordings and read text transcripts. They saw surveillance footage of Marina calmly buying coffee minutes after one child's declared death. Her defense team struggled. They presented a narrative of a mentally fragile woman, someone who had endured trauma, postpartum depression, societal isolation. They suggested that perhaps Marina had dissociative episodes. Perhaps she didn't even fully understand what she was doing. They asked for compassion, for the jury to see the human behind the headlines. But compassion requires credibility, and that was gone. Then came the moment that stunned the courtroom into silence. It was a scheduled day of forensic expert testimony. The lead investigator had reconstructed timelines, reviewing medical charts, staff logs, security camera footage. He described how Marina had a pattern, entering rooms alone with her daughters during vulnerable hours, between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m., and exiting moments before alarms were raised. Then, in a quiet corner of the courtroom, seated with a guardian, was the last person anyone expected to see, Georgina. Though declared dead in early media reports, Georgina had actually been revived briefly before final hospitalization. While she had ultimately passed, her testimony had been recorded weeks prior, during a lucid window under protective supervision. But what made the moment chilling was not a video or audio recording. It was a silent reenactment, a short clip played in court, captured during a therapy session. In the footage, Georgina is seated at a table with a child psychologist. They are using dolls to represent people. The psychologist gently prompts her, "Who was in the room when you got sick?" Georgina, barely audible, says, "Mommy." The tape ends. In real time, in the courtroom, the psychologist takes the stand and describes how Georgina, consistent across sessions, always identified her mother as the last person with her before her breathing slowed, before the lights went blurry, as she once described it. And then, almost symbolically, the court played another short clip, a session where Georgina, silent for over 2 minutes, slowly raised her hand and pointed toward a photograph placed on the table, Marina. It wasn't verbal testimony, but it was memory. It was gesture. It was the kind of silent scream only a child could make, and the kind a courtroom could never ignore. Marina's hands trembled for the first time. She looked not at the screen, not at her attorneys, but at her lap. The room was frozen. No one breathed. That single quiet gesture did what hundreds of documents and hours of testimony could not. It pierced through the performance, through the layered deceptions, and revealed the one truth Marina couldn't bury: the memory of a daughter who had seen everything. And now, so had the jury. The trial of Marina Giorgio lasted just over 3 months, but its emotional weight lingered far longer. On March 18, 2025, the Athens Mixed Jury Court returned its verdict: guilty on all counts. 3 consecutive life sentences were handed down. 1 for Melina, 1 for Iris, 1 for Georgina. No possibility of parole. No ambiguity. No mercy. When the sentence was read aloud, Marina stood motionless. Not a single tear. Her lawyers exchanged hushed words, while her mother, seated 2 rows behind, broke into sobs. The courtroom was packed. Parents, journalists, even former hospital staff sat in collective silence. The sound of the judge's gavel closing the proceedings felt like a final breath exhaled after years of tension. The streets outside erupted in applause. Not for joy, but for justice. For 3 girls whose lives had been extinguished before they even had the chance to define them. But beneath the headlines and the courtroom footage, the real story was more chilling and more human. Marina's story wasn't just about murder. It was about control. A woman desperate to maintain an image of the perfect mother. The doting caregiver. The helpless victim of fate. She crafted a narrative so meticulously that it worked. For years, doctors trusted her. Family sympathized. Journalists wrote articles about a cursed family, a mother grieving 3 daughters lost to inexplicable illnesses. And perhaps that was the most terrifying part: how convincing she was. How the performance, rehearsed, repeated, refined, was accepted because it looked familiar. Because when a mother cries, we believe her. When she screams for help, we rush to provide it. When she mourns, we do not question why. But Marina weaponized that instinct. She knew the power of narrative. She orchestrated tragedy after tragedy, always maintaining a flawless record of hospital visits, medical appointments, social media grief. She lit candles at memorials. She clutched teddy bears. She posted tributes online. And still, behind all of it, she believed she was smarter than everyone in the room. But forensic science doesn't grieve. And children, even silent ones, remember. What brought Marina down wasn't just evidence. It was the psychological pressure she didn't see coming. Forensics found the ketamine. The pathologists saw through the suffocation signs. But it was Georgina, that one surviving thread of memory, that unraveled the entire illusion. Children often internalize trauma in ways adults underestimate. What Georgina couldn't say in words, she expressed in gestures. Her memory didn't fade just because no one had asked. And when finally invited to remember, she did. That single, silent point toward her mother's face said more than a 1,000-page trial brief ever could. The trial also exposed how dangerous unchecked narrative control can be. Marina didn't kill in a moment of rage. She did so deliberately and repeatedly to preserve an image. Perhaps she feared being alone. Perhaps she feared being judged as a failure. Perhaps in the deepest layers of her psyche, she believed the world owed her attention, and that losing her children was the price others would have to pay to give it to her. Whatever the motive, the lesson was the same. A lie told perfectly is still a lie, and the truth, no matter how delayed, eventually surfaces. The Marina Giorgio case now sits alongside some of Europe's most disturbing examples of familial crime. But its impact is different. It has changed hospital protocols in Greece. Pediatric death reviews have been tightened. And more significantly, it has made doctors pause just for a moment when tragedy repeats itself in a pattern too painful to ignore. In prison, Marina remains isolated. According to sources, she avoids eye contact. She receives few visitors. Her lawyers continue to appeal, But the public no longer listens. The silence that once protected her has been shattered by a child who never spoke a word in court, yet delivered the loudest verdict of all. It was not the scream of rage, not the cry of pain, but the truth, as remembered by the smallest witness, and confirmed by the cold, impartial science she never believed would matter. The courtroom was built for order, but on the first day of Marina Giorgio's trial, it pulsed with unease. Spectators filed in early, some just curious, others with grief or outrage in their eyes. The media had turned the trial into a national obsession. She was no longer the grieving mother. She was the poisoning widow of Patras, the quiet killer, the mother who wept too well. Marina entered wearing black, head lowered, hands clasped like a woman in mourning. She avoided cameras, but not attention. Her defense attorney stayed close, whispering strategy. She showed no fear, just restraint, as if every expression had been choreographed. The prosecution wasted no time dismantling the illusion. They began not with accusation, but with evidence, hard, scientific, inescapable. Georgina, her eldest daughter, died of a ketamine overdose. The drug had no legitimate medical use for the girl. No doctor had prescribed it. No nurse had administered it. And yet, it was there, traced in her blood. The dosage was lethal. Then came the testimonies of pediatric specialists, forensic analysts, and the nurse who found Marina calmly scrolling on her phone while Georgina was in cardiac arrest. Another nurse described how, minutes after Georgina's vitals crashed, Marina asked whether the defibrillator had been properly connected, a detail she shouldn't have known. More unsettling, however, was the emerging timeline. Marina was the only person alone with her children when each episode occurred. In all three cases, Melina, Iris, and Georgina, the fatal events happened in those quiet moments of supposed caregiving. No security footage, no witnesses, just Marina and the girls. But the most haunting testimony came from a forensic pathologist. With clinical precision, she walked the court through the autopsy results. Melina had signs of asphyxiation, not respiratory illness. Iris's lungs had no evidence of disease, but bruises suggested airway obstruction. It wasn't natural. It wasn't sudden. It was inflicted. Still, Marina's defense pressed on. They argued postpartum psychosis, depression. They painted her as a broken woman whose life had collapsed under the unbearable weight of loss. They said perhaps she didn't act with intent, but with confusion, a woman trapped in the ruins of her own grief. But then came the twist no one expected, not even Marina. In a decision fraught with ethical tension, Georgina's therapy sessions were submitted as evidence. Though the child had passed away, early interviews and drawings were collected during a previous psychiatric evaluation following her sister Iris's death. One image in particular was displayed, a crude drawing of a mother and child, the mother with a red X over her mouth, the child with tears and an oxygen mask drawn in blue. Next to the child's hand, a small caption, scrawled in uneven letters, read, "Mama was there." The courtroom hushed. And then came the moment that changed everything. One of Georgina's former therapists was called to testify. She described how, during one of their sessions, Georgina had mimed something with her hand, a gesture of covering her own mouth, then gasping for breath. At the time, it was interpreted as a general expression of trauma. But after the trial began, it took on chilling new meaning. The prosecution used it to deliver a blow that Marina could not deflect. In closing arguments, the prosecutor said, "This child could not speak, but she remembered, and her memory has spoken in silence louder than any witness." Marina's demeanor cracked. Her gaze shifted. Her shoulders dropped ever so slightly. It was the first visible fracture in a performance she had kept flawless for 3 years. The courtroom was silent as the jury watched those drawings. Not just as evidence, but as emotional testimony from a child who died too soon and still found a way to tell her story. By the end of the week, there was no doubt. Marina had not lost her children to illness. She had taken them, one by one, with method, with motive, with calculation. But in trying to erase the witnesses, she forgot that memory lingers. It lingers in files, in fibers, in the fingertips of a child with a crayon. And sometimes even silence speaks. On March 18, 2025, the Athens Mixed Jury Court delivered its verdict. In a unanimous decision, Marina Giorgio was found guilty on all counts, 3 charges of premeditated murder, 1 for each of her daughters, Melina, Iris, and Georgina. The courtroom didn't erupt. There were no cheers, no cries, just a heavy silence, the kind that follows the confirmation of what many had already come to believe, but still hoped wasn't true. Marina stood as the judge read the sentence. 3 life terms without the possibility of parole. Her face remained still, almost unreadable, as though the mask she'd worn for years had fused with her skin. Some thought she might cry. Others expected outrage. But Marina gave neither. She stood suspended, a woman without an audience. The aftermath of the case sent ripples across Greece and far beyond. People debated the signs. Had the hospitals failed to act quickly enough? Did the community overlook warning flags because of preconceived notions about motherhood? And how could a woman so seemingly ordinary orchestrate something so unspeakably cruel? Psychologists weighed in. Journalists dug into Marina's past. And forensic psychiatrists, now allowed to speak, revealed that Marina exhibited patterns consistent with factitious disorder imposed on another, once known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. It is a rare, deeply manipulative condition in which a caregiver, often a parent, deliberately causes illness or injury to someone in their care to gain attention, sympathy, or praise for their role as a devoted helper. But Marina's case was darker than a disorder. What shocked experts was her strategic sophistication. She didn't act impulsively. She staged grief. She studied medical terminology. She moved between hospitals, taking her daughters to specialists to build a timeline of concern. And she used emotional exhaustion as camouflage, knowing that in times of loss, people hesitate to question a grieving mother. That was her greatest weapon, public empathy. Her case revealed something chilling about human psychology, that some lies aren't told with words, they're lived, day by day, moment by moment, with the intention of deceiving everyone, including oneself. But in the end, she underestimated 3 things. First, she underestimated science. Forensics doesn't care for theatrics. It can't be manipulated by tears or charm. The ketamine found in Georgina's system had no alibi. The bruises around Iris's mouth weren't theoretical. The sequence of events across all 3 deaths painted a pattern that no longer resembled fate. It resembled intent. Second, she underestimated memory. Children, even very young ones, remember more than we think. Georgina didn't have a language to articulate what had happened, but she carried it in gestures, in expressions, in drawings, in silence. The human brain records trauma in ways we're only beginning to understand. Marina tried to erase the witnesses, but even in death, memory remained. And finally, Marina underestimated public scrutiny. For years, she manipulated perception in small circles, family, doctors, neighbors. But once the truth started to emerge, the very thing she relied on, attention, became her downfall. The media picked up on inconsistencies. Investigators reopened closed cases. Experts questioned timing. She built a house of cards on public sympathy, and that same public watched it collapse. Today, Marina sits in isolation. No children to visit. No journalists allowed in. Her story has ended, but the questions linger. How do we define evil in a world where empathy can be faked so convincingly? What does justice mean when the victims were too young to testify? And how can society learn to distinguish between pain that's genuine and pain that's performed? The Marina Giorgio case didn't just convict a killer. It exposed a blind spot in how we view motherhood, grief, and trust. It forced us to examine the ways in which we assign innocence based on appearance, and how easily a person can weaponize their role, not for protection, but for control. Because, in the end, what Marina wanted was not to be a mother. She wanted to be seen as a perfect one. And that desire, unchecked, became deadly. In every courtroom, there is a moment. One moment that defines the trial. Not a document, not a speech, not even a verdict, but a gesture, a glance, a silence that holds the weight of truth. In Marina Giorgio's trial, that moment came not from the prosecution, not from expert testimony, but from a child. The very child Marina thought she had silenced forever. Georgina had been gone for over 2 years. The world mourned her as a victim, a little girl lost too soon. But before her death, Georgina had been observed drawing strange images, stick figures lying in beds, with one taller figure standing nearby. She would often cry at night, flinch at sudden movements, and grow anxious when her mother entered the room alone. Doctors had noted her growing psychological distress in the months before she died, but no one could connect the dots. Not then. It was only later, during the investigation, that one of her therapists testified. She said Georgina had once whispered, "Mommy makes it stop when I breathe too loud." The therapist didn't understand the meaning at the time. She thought it was about discipline or a child's fear of punishment. But now in the courtroom, those words came rushing back with chilling clarity. And then came the gesture. The court had allowed a brief video presentation, a compilation of footage from Georgina's final hospital stay, obtained from CCTV cameras. In one frame, barely noticed before, Georgina, lying weak in her hospital bed, is seen looking directly at her mother, then turning her head away. Slowly, she raises her hand and covers her own mouth. It's a child's instinct, a habit, a memory. That still image was paused on the courtroom screen. A hush fell. The jury stared. So did the gallery. Even Marina glanced up. In that split second, something shifted in the room. Because no testimony, no cross-examination, no forensic analysis could say what that gesture did. It was not rehearsed. It wasn't planted or suggested. It was raw, involuntary, human. It was a child reliving what no child should. The silence in the courtroom grew louder than words. There were no gasps, no whispers. Just recognition that this girl, this small, quiet, frightened girl, had tried to speak. Not with words, but with actions. And no one had listened in time. The silence screamed. For weeks after, journalists described that moment. Some called it the invisible witness. Others labeled it the ghost in the courtroom. But it was neither. It was Georgina, preserved in memory and movement, reminding the world of something it had missed, that even children too young to testify still carry their truths. And Marina? She looked away, not because she couldn't bear the image, but because in that second, she knew her performance had failed. The part she played for so long, the grieving mother, the devoted caregiver, the victim of cruel fate, collapsed in the presence of her daughter's unspoken truth. The silence had become evidence. Psychologists would later say that trauma can imprint in the body, that gestures, repeated unconsciously, reveal what the brain cannot express. In Georgina's case, that simple movement, hand to mouth, said everything. About fear, about memory, about survival. It became the trial's turning point. The jury members would later admit that they had doubts. Marina had been clever, consistent, emotionally persuasive. But once they saw that image, doubt turned to resolve. That's when the silence screamed. And in that moment, justice didn't need a closing argument. In the days following the courtroom revelation, Marina Giorgio's silence grew heavier than her words. Her expressions became tight, her glances avoidant. What once looked like sorrow now appeared calculated, even rehearsed. The courtroom no longer responded to her tears. No one leaned in with sympathy. They leaned back, watching her unravel. Her defense attorney began to shift tactics. Once adamant in her complete innocence, the narrative subtly changed. She was a mother in pain, he said. She suffered the unimaginable 3 times. Grief can fracture even the strongest minds. But the court had already seen through the fractures. They weren't random. They were symmetrical, patterned, repeating. Melina died after a hospital stay. Iris was found in her crib, no cause apparent. Georgina's final moments happened during a lull in medical supervision, always when Marina was alone. Each event, spaced out over 3 years, carried the illusion of coincidence. But under a forensic microscope, the timeline read like choreography. Each child's health would decline after extended contact with Marina. She'd rush them to the hospital, call for help, arrive crying. And yet, somehow, only she was ever present when their breathing stopped. Investigators revealed her online search history, disturbing, specific, and damning. She had researched medications that cause respiratory depression. She had looked up rare conditions in children that mimic suffocation. Most chilling of all, they found deleted queries about hospital CCTV systems and how long doctors watch monitors at night. Still, Marina said nothing. What cracked her mirror wasn't just the evidence. It was that her narrative no longer matched her eyes. Her grief had lines, but they were straight. There were no cracks in her voice. No messiness in her sorrow. Real grief is disorganized. It stumbles. Marina's performance was too clean, too careful. And then came her own mother's testimony. Called to the stand, Marina's elderly mother sat trembling. At first, she defended her daughter, as any parent might. But when questioned about Marina's childhood, something shifted. She was different, she admitted. Not cruel, but detached. She didn't cry at funerals. She'd watch people, but I couldn't tell if she felt anything. The room froze. That was the first moment Marina reacted. A sharp intake of breath, followed by her eyes darting toward her mother. But she said nothing. The psychologist on the prosecution's team later introduced a concept many had quietly considered: factitious disorder imposed on another, once known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. A rare, dangerous psychological condition in which a caregiver, usually a parent, causes or fabricates illness in a child to gain attention or sympathy. The courtroom listened as the psychologist walked through the behavioral traits: frequent hospital visits, excessive concern, exaggerated medical histories, emotional manipulation, craving for sympathy. All traits Marina had displayed. But more than the diagnosis, the psychologist offered a warning. "This is not about madness," she said calmly. "It's about control." Marina did not lose her mind. She controlled her image, her environment, her children's health, until she couldn't anymore. That statement rang through the room like a bell. Because the truth finally was undeniable. Marina hadn't killed in a moment of rage. She hadn't acted out of confusion or despair. She had orchestrated her children's deaths over time, quietly, methodically, without ever losing her composure. Her mirror cracked not from a single blow, but from the slow pressure of truth pressing in from all sides: forensic evidence, digital trails, courtroom analysis, and a daughter's silent testimony. By the end of that day in court, Marina no longer looked like a grieving mother. She looked like someone who had been caught rehearsing a lie too many times. Her shoulders sagged. Her hair, once impeccably styled, began to fall loose. She refused to look at the jury. She asked for a break. The court denied it. She had lost control. And in Marina's world, that was the greatest threat of all. The mirror had cracked. And through those cracks, the world finally saw her. On March 18, 2025, the Athens Mixed Jury Court delivered its unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts. Marina Giorgio was sentenced to 3 life terms, one for each child whose final breaths were stolen under the illusion of maternal care. As the courtroom clerk read the judgment aloud, Marina stood still, rigid, almost defiant, her hands clenched tight behind her back. Not a single tear, not a flicker of emotion. For the first time, the silence around her was not one she orchestrated. It was society's verdict, echoing louder than any outburst could. Outside the courthouse, the city of Patras wept. Candles flickered beneath school photos of Melina, Iris, and Georgina. Strangers, neighbors, even those who once defended Marina, now stood in quiet mourning. The betrayal wasn't just legal. It was personal. The very idea of motherhood had been manipulated, its sacredness used as a weapon. The judge spoke directly to Marina as the sentence was handed down. "You hid behind your role. You turned motherhood into theater. But no script, no grief you performed, can erase what the evidence has shown." Marina didn't respond. The prosecutor, later interviewed, said something chilling. It was never about love. It was about applause. Marina wanted sympathy, not connection. And when the applause quieted, she turned the volume back up at the cost of her children's lives. In prison, Marina's world shrank. Gone were the cameras. Gone were the sympathetic interviews. The interviews she once gave where she posed as a shattered mother looking for justice. Gone were the rehearsals. She became inmate number 33825, a woman isolated not just by concrete walls, but by the sheer enormity of what she had done. And yet, she never confessed. She never explained why. Psychologists debated endlessly. Was it Munchausen by proxy? Narcissistic personality disorder? Or simply evil veiled in maternal routine? But perhaps the truth is simpler. Marina believed her pain mattered more than anyone else's reality. Her image, her needs, her story, always centered. Her children were the quiet collateral. Their voices silenced. Their health sacrificed. Their lives, ultimately, expendable in service of her emotional validation. And still, Georgina's final act, that silent point across the courtroom, lived on in the public's memory. That moment was never spoken of by the judge or acknowledged officially in the ruling. But it echoed. Because that gesture was not just about Marina. It was about all the things children carry, but do not say. All the unsaid truths behind closed doors. All the moments of discomfort we excuse because someone looks like a good mother. In many ways, this story is not about Marina at all. It's about vigilance. It's about listening when something doesn't sit right, even when a person cries the right way, hugs at the right time, and says all the right things. Because sometimes behind the performance, there's a script far more dangerous than silence. In the years following her conviction, a scholarship was established in Georgina's name, a fund for children recovering from abuse, created not by Marina's family, but by the nurses who had cared for Georgina in her final days. The ones who remembered her quiet strength, her faint smiles, her resilience in the face of an unseen enemy. Georgina's photo now sits in that hospital's pediatric wing, and next to it a plaque with a simple inscription, "The silence that screamed." Because that's what her story became, not just a cautionary tale, but a legacy of quiet courage. Marina Giorgio thought she could outsmart science, manipulate sympathy, and rewrite reality. She was wrong. And in the end, it wasn't a prosecutor or a forensic report that sealed her fate. It was the memory of a child. This story is a reminder that darkness doesn't always come in the form of chaos. Sometimes it dresses in neat clothes, brings snacks to the hospital, and cries right on cue. And sometimes the bravest testimony comes from the smallest voice, not spoken in words, but in memory, gesture, and gaze. The truth, no matter how quiet, finds a way to rise. And when it does, even the most perfect lie can't hold.